From Woodsong by Gary Paulson. In Woodsong, Gary Paulson describes his life as a trapper in the woods of northern Minnesota. He lived with his wife Ruth and his son James in a small cabin that did not have plumbing or electricity. At the time, Paulson was not writing stories, but simply learning the ways of the woods. This episode describes one of the lessons he learned. We have bear trouble. Because we feed processed meat to the dogs, there is always the smell of meat over the kennel. In the summer, it can be a bit high because the dogs like to save their food, sometimes for a day or two or four, burying it to dig up later. We live on the edge of wilderness, and consequently the meat smell brings any number of visitors from the woods. Skunks abound, and foxes and coyotes and wolves and weasels, all predators. We once had an eagle live over the kennel for more than a week, scavenging from the dogs, and a crazy group of ravens has pretty much taken over the puppy pen. Ravens are protected by the state, and they seem to know it. When I walk toward the puppy pen with the buckets of meat, it's a toss-up to see who gets it, the pups or the birds. They have actually pecked the puppies away from the food pans until they have gone through and taken what they want. Spring, when the bears come, is the worst. They have been in hibernation through the winter, and they are hungry beyond caution. The meat smell draws them like flies, and we frequently have 2 or 3 around the kennel at the same time. Typically, they do not bother us much, although my wife had a bear chaser from the garden to the house one morning, but they do bother the dogs. They are so big and strong that the dogs fear them, and the bears trade on this fear to get their food. It's common to see them scare a dog into his house and take his food. Twice we have had dogs killed by rough bear swats that broke their necks, and the bears took their food. We have evolved an uneasy peace with them, but there is the problem of familiarity. The first time you see a bear in the kennel, it is a novelty, but when the same ones are there day after day, you wind up naming some of them, Old Notch Ear, Billy Joe, etc. There gets to be a too relaxed attitude. We started to treat them like pets. A major mistake. There was a large male around the kennel for a week or so. He had a white streak across his head, which I guessed was a wound scar from some hunter. Bear hunting is allowed here. He wasn't all that bad, so we didn't mind him. He would frighten the dogs and take their hidden stashes now and then, but he didn't harm them, and we became accustomed to him hanging around. We called him Scarhead, and now and again we would joke about him as if he were one of the yard animals. At this time, we had 3 cats, 42 dogs, 15 or 20 chickens, 8 ducks, 19 large white geese, a few banty hens, 10 fryers which we'd raised from chicks and couldn't, as my wife put it, snuff and eat, and 6 woods-wise goats. The bears, strangely, didn't bother any of the yard animals. There must have been a rule or some order to the way they lived, because they would hit the kennel and steal from the dogs, but leave the chickens and goats and other yard stock completely alone, although you would have had a hard time convincing the goats of this fact. The goats spent a great deal of time with their back hair up, whuffing and blowing snot at the bears, and at the dogs, who would gladly have eaten them. The goats never really believed in the truce. There is not a dump or landfill to take our trash to, and so we separate it, organic, inorganic, and deal with it ourselves. We burn the paper in a screened enclosure, and it is fairly efficient, but it's impossible to get all the food particles off wrapping paper, so when it's burned, the food particles burn with it, and give off a burnt food smell. And nothing draws bears like burning food. It must be that they have learned to understand human dumps, where they spend a great deal of time foraging. And they learn amazingly fast. In Alaska, for instance, the bears already know that the sound of a moose hunter's hunt means there will be a fresh gut pile when the hunter cleans the moose. They come at a run when they hear the shot. It's often a close race to see if the hunter will get to the moose before the bears take it away. Because we're on the south edge of the wilderness area, we try to wait until there is a northerly breeze before we burn, so the food smell will carry south, but it doesn't always help. Sometimes bears, wolves, and other predators are already south, working the sheep farms down where it is more settled. They take a terrible toll of sheep, and we catch them on the way back through. That's what happened one July morning. Scarhead had been gone for 2 or 3 days, and the breeze was right, so I went to burn the trash. I fired it off and went back into the house for a moment, not more than 2 minutes. When I came back out, Scarhead was in the burn area. His tracks, directly through the tomatoes in the garden, showed he'd come from the south. He was having a grand time. The fire didn't bother him. He was trying to reach a paw in around the edges of flame to get at whatever smelled so good. He had torn things apart quite a bit, ripped one side off the burn enclosure, and I was having a bad day, and it made me mad. I was standing across the burning fire from him, and without thinking, because I was so used to him, I picked up a stick